My name is Angelo Lopez. I'm a Filipino-American editorial cartoonist based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm very honored today to be speaking with Terry Anderson. Now, Terry is a wonderful editorial cartoonist from Scotland, and he's also a member of the Cartoonists Rights Network International. Today, we'll be having a conversation on the work of Cartoonists Rights Network International. So thank you, Terry, for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's my pleasure, Angelo.
Okay, well, let me start and stuff. I guess just a little bit of your background. How did you become an editorial cartoonist, and how did you become involved in Cartoonists Rights Network International?
I was that kid in the class that draws. There's always one. You were probably it in yours.
Yes.
And all through school, whenever asked, I always said that I wanted to be a cartoonist. I'm not exactly sure where I picked the word up. I'm told that I was using it from about 8 years old. So I'd obviously heard it or read it somewhere. To my recollection, I think the first time that I kind of understood it as something that somebody could do for a career was when I was homesick and my mother came home from the library with a lot of those little paperback books that you used to have, kind of cheap newsprint paper, and collecting Peanuts or Garfield or what have you, but it was one cartoonist, one cartoon feature collected into a little paperback book, and many of those books. So looking at the books and looking at how many cartoons were in each one and seeing just one person's name, Jim Davis or Charles Schulz or whoever it may be, I think that was the first time that it kind of occurred to me, this must be what that person does non-stop all the time, every day, because look at how many cartoons there are. So it's safe to say that in almost any country in the world, that's a fairly unusual thing to want to be. It's pretty rare where I am. And the careers officers and the arts teachers didn't really know what to tell me, how to advise me correctly. And this was in an era before what happens today. I think that kids that have that same ability get steered towards digital platforms, towards games design, towards all that stuff where, you know, vast quantities of visual images are required to get those products out, and consequently there's a huge number of creatives involved. That hadn't happened yet, and certainly was not happening here in Scotland. So I kind of muddled through, kind of consistently underperformed, in particularly in art, because I was kind of stubbornly pursuing this thing against the advice of everybody else, and eventually it no longer happens here. But at my time as a high school student, there was an option in your very last year to pursue your studies more as a kind of a bridge towards college. So more of a focus on independent learning, less time supervised, more time working on your own initiative and so on. And I was, compared to my classmates, I was relatively young because of where my birthday falls. I was on the younger side. So my parents were not interested in me leaving high school until the bitter end. So I was there for the duration. And so in that last year, because I was left to my own devices, I was able to, without argument, concentrate on cartooning. And before the year was over, my work had started to appear in the Herald, which is the main newspaper in Glasgow, the big city, where I grew up just outside of Glasgow. So submitted that along with everything else that was in my portfolio, but published work.
Yeah.
And as a consequence of that, got an A, the only A I ever got
Yeah.
in art. And so I continued to contribute to that newspaper, all told, with a little break in the middle, because as viewers might have read in the introduction, I studied in the United States for a time. But I contributed to the Herald for about 15 years, all told,
Yeah.
all the way through to really the economic crash in 2008, when a lot of contributors were let go
Yeah.
at that time. By then, I'd started working with a group in Glasgow, the Scottish Cartoon Art Studio. We had exhibited in some museums. We did a lot of caricature work, for example, and
Yeah.
exhibited that in museums in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I'd also become involved with organising.
Oh,
I was the president of the Scottish Artists Union, which is the trade union for
yeah.
all visual artists in Scotland.
Mhm.
Through 2014, when Scotland had its independence referendum, I organised a big international exhibition themed around that, with cartoons from all over the world, and that was shown in about half dozen different venues here in the UK, in France, in Spain, and as a consequence of that, I was interviewed for a couple of different things, talking about politics, talking about cartoonists, and so on. And I had become aware of a Cartoonists Rights Network International, and had contributed to a couple of their campaigns when they were asking for support for particular cartoonists. And the interviewer, kind of like yourself, just had one of these questions lined up, which is sort of saying, what's next, or what do you think about doing in the future, or however it
Yeah.
was phrased. And I kind of off the cuff said, I could see myself working with an organization like that.
Yeah.
And the person who at that time looked after the organization's social media, unbeknownst to me, was actually based in the UK, and
Oh,
had listened to this podcast interview that I'd done. And
yeah.
she in turn sent it to at that time, our executive director.
Oh, okay.
That was 2014. 2015, in the first weeks of 2015, the Charlie Hebdo attack happened.
Oh,
And
okay.
over the course of 2015, there was obviously a lot of reaction to that. And
Yeah.
in the September of that year, Cartoonists Rights organised a summit meeting
Oh,
with representatives from different organisations, cartoonists from different countries.
yeah.
I was invited to that. And by the conclusion of the summit, I had been adopted onto the board of the
Oh,
organisation.
yeah.
Our founder director retired in 2019, and I
Okay.
assumed his position then. So I've been in charge of the organization for 5 years now.
Oh, okay. So the shootings at Charlie Hebdo had a ripple effect upon all of the European cartoonists, I guess. Especially, I guess, since Scotland is just across the waters from Paris and stuff, it must have really had a profound effect on you.
Yeah, I didn't lose friends that day, but friends of mine lost friends, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
okay,
Um,
yeah,
because, quite apart from anything else, like I said earlier, there just aren't that many of us.
yeah,
There just
yeah,
aren't.
yeah,
And particularly in Europe, there are a large number of annual festivals where cartoonists gather,
yeah.
and one in particular in France. That by the time of the shootings, I had attended multiple times the salon in a small village called Saint-Just-le-Martel,
Mhm.
just outside Limoges, in France. The cartoonists who perished, and I always make a point of pointing out they weren't the only people that died that day. 12 staffers at Charlie Hebdo perished in total. There were shootings and injuries later on that day in Paris as well. But the 5 cartoonists who died were regulars at that salon, and so I had certainly met a couple of them before. But like I said, it was more a case of very good friends of mine that week were devastated by the loss of friends of theirs,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's why you saw, and that's the same. Like I say, I'm far from unique in that. That's the same for cartoonists all over the place. So that's why you saw the huge number of cartoons and reactions that were drawn in the immediate aftermath of that. But in terms of the long term effects,
Yeah.
the it'll be a decade soon. It'll be a decade since in January of next year, and to this day,
Oh,
the salon that I mentioned, simply
yeah.
because it's a large gathering of cartoonists, still has armed police at the
Oh,
door,
wow.
which was not the case when I first started attending. Um,
Yeah.
and you know, every exhibit, festival, um, anything to do with cartoons really that happens in the public space
Oh,
has to still have those considerations, um, because the atrocity itself happened in 2015, but then subsequent to that, 20, 2020, we had the killing of the teacher Samuel Paty, who had been
yeah.
um, talking about the cartoons in his classroom. So everything was kind of reactivated
Yeah.
at that stage. So it's still a concern. I honestly feel that nothing like that will ever happen again. I really don't think anything like that will ever happen again.
Okay.
The scale of it and the impact of it, it kind of can't be repeated. And I honestly don't think France is the only place where it would have had the kind of impact that it had. Um, France is quite unique in terms of the esteem that it places upon cartoons and cartoonists. This is why
Uh,
so many cartoonists um, not only enjoy visiting France, but in the case of the kind of cartoonists that we work with, many of them end up seeking refuge in France, um,
okay.
for that reason. So it's kind of, I don't mean to laugh, but it's kind of ironic that the single deadliest attack on cartoonists ever happened in France, but simultaneously it's the place where they feel
The safest.
the safest in some respects, because again because of the esteem
Yeah.
in which they're held.
Yeah. Is it because of their history of like Damier and, just that wonderful history of that time?
Sure, that's a big part of it, but of course, there's plenty of other countries that can boast the same.
Yeah.
It's to do with simultaneously it being bound up with their cultural history, but also there's something to do with the quality of their discourse, I guess is the best way to put it. Their
Okay.
public discourse. Um, I'm extremely fond of them, the French, but goodness me, they like to talk and they like to thrash things out and argue the case and make the counter argument and so on and so forth. And a big part of that um, is the humor,
Uh,
is reserving the right to to be skeptical, cynical, scathing,
mhm.
and so the cartoons play a big part of that.
Yeah. I think in America, where our political discourse is so polarized, I much prefer what you're describing with the French and stuff because we need to get back to that where we can civilly, people of opposing views can civilly debate about ideas and stuff. And that's something America, I think it sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, America needs to return to some of what France has right now and stuff. So that's pretty cool. So
I would agree
okay,
with that. Yeah.
yeah. So okay, so let me ask you. Um, so could you tell me a little bit of what Cartoonist Rights Network does, and could you give a brief history of Cartoonist Rights Network International?
Sure. The organization was incorporated in 1999. It's based
Mhm.
in the state of Virginia, despite my accent. It is an American a non-profit, a 501c3 in the United States, founded by Dr. Robert Russell, bro to his friends. And his background really was nothing to do with cartoons. He was an international peace worker and worked in the field on peace building and democracy building projects in places like Uganda, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, etc. And it was while he was in the field, really, that he came to an understanding of the contribution that cartoonists can make, um, and also the extent to which, as we'll probably get into later, they are a useful barometer for how freedom of expression and democratic rights are doing generally in a society. Um, so as he got a little bit older and spending less time in the field, less time overseas, but still wanting to work constructively, he sought to establish this organization. Um, so cartoonists obviously are our constituency.
Mhm.
Uh, I would say, however, that we are first and foremost a human rights organization.
Okay.
So we do not concern ourselves with the creative, uh, professional rights of cartoonists.
Yeah.
Um, that's, for one thing, that's best left to trade associations and trade unions and so on a country by country basis, because obviously laws and regulations and everything vary enormously from location to location.
Yeah.
Never mind language barriers and everything else. Um,
Yeah.
but consequently, when I say cartoonist, I don't necessarily mean someone for whom that is their full-time job or even
Yeah.
their part-time job.
Yeah.
Again, for reasons we'll get into, quite apart from anything else, with each passing year, fewer and fewer people are doing it for a job. So if we
Mhm.
restricted ourselves to those who consider themselves full-time professional cartoonists, we would eradicate ourselves because the base is disappearing on that basis.
Yeah.
So you are a potential client of ours, very simply, if you have encountered a threat or a violation to your human rights because of a cartoon that you drew.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if you got paid for it, doesn't matter if it was published in a newspaper, doesn't matter if it was seen on a street corner or placed on a website or posted to social media or whatever it may be. But if you drew a
Yeah.
cartoon, and then as a consequence of that, your human rights are in jeopardy, then that
Mhm.
places you within our
Perfect.
locus.
Okay. I'm glad you're doing that. If anything ever happens to me, you guys can help me because I'm no longer in the newspaper and stuff. So thank you. Thank you and stuff. So, okay. Could you tell me about the recent cases? Okay. Tell me if I pronounce these names wrong, but could you tell me about the recent cases of cartoonists Atena Farghadani, Ashraf Omar, and Zehra Omeroglu and stuff?
Omeroglu, Zehra
Yeah.
Omeroglu, Ashraf
Okay.
Omar, and Atena Farghadani.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So
Okay.
I'll start with Omar, Ashraf Omar first,
Okay.
because he's the freshest, certainly
Okay.
at the time we were speaking. So, Ashraf is Egyptian and based in Cairo. Despite what I just said about the cartoonists not having outlets, he is one of the lucky ones. He works with an independent news platform called Al Manasa, based in Cairo. So mid-July, plainclothes personnel came to his home, took him away for a period of time. The police even denied that it was them that arrested him. So when he initially disappeared, it was framed as a kidnapping
Yeah.
because it wasn't confirmed who had taken him away. Eventually, the police did confirm that they had arrested him, and so he's been held ever since on pretty ridiculous, frankly, and certainly unsubstantiated charges to do with support of terrorism and
Yeah.
misuse of digital platforms for the purposes of misinformation, disinformation. Allegedly, while he was being interrogated, he was threatened with electrocution.
Oh,
We
wow.
certainly think that he was. We certainly think that he was beaten. And since the time of his initial arrest, when you and I are speaking, he very recently had his third extension of the period where he can be held pre-trial.
Uh-huh.
Now that, to be honest, could go on indefinitely. It's not unheard of in Egypt for that kind of pre-trial detention to go on for weeks, months.
Yeah.
So we're certainly very concerned about his safety, although from what we can glean, he does seem to be in relatively good spirits and health in prison. But pre-trial detention is grossly unfair. You know, he should be bailed, and he should be given the opportunity to return to his home and await trial or whatever criminal proceedings ensue. From
Yeah.
there really is no reason to hold him as a prisoner before he even has his day in court.
Yeah.
Similarly, Atena in Tehran, in Iran, was arrested last April.
Yeah.
She had been, her work had been shown at the Oslo Freedom Forum, Oslo Freedom Forum in Norway, and she'd been invited to attend, and because of that, had obviously had to make arrangements, seek permission to leave, get the relevant paperwork, and so on, and was denied all of that. And she objected
Yeah.
in the strongest terms, and as she is wont to do, posted literally a poster in the street, Pasteur Street, which is very close to the main government buildings and so on in Tehran. So there was no question that having done something like that, she wasn't going to be arrested fairly quickly, and indeed she was.
Yeah.
Not her first time, it has to be said. The world really knows her name from her time as a prisoner in 2014 through 2016. She posted cartoons to Facebook that got her in trouble at that time. And indeed, she won our award in 2015. Cartoonist Rights gives an award for courage in cartooning.
Yeah.
Um, so she's been held ever since. Again, our understanding is quite badly beaten at the time of her arrest, and she was held for a period last summer, about 6 weeks or so, and during that time, she alleges that the prison staff tried to force feed her with something she didn't recognize as food. She thought
Oh,
that perhaps she was being poisoned.
yeah.
So she refused, and subsequently that led to her being hospitalized and then eventually released. So again, a situation where her, quite apart from the criminal charges or anything that might arise from that, her physical health is being jeopardized as long as she's being held. A little bit closer to Europe, in Turkey, where Zehra is from. Zehra is a contributor to the Leman humor magazine in Turkey. We were talking earlier about France's record. Historically speaking, Turkey can go pretty toe to toe with France. Turkey, until very recently, had a very strong, rich, varied culture of cartoonists and comics and so on. It's all kind of deteriorated, it has to be said, under President Erdogan. Le Mans is one of the last magazines standing. It's comparable to Charlie Hebdo in France, El Jueves in Spain, you know, adult, not for kids, very squarely an adult humor publication. And she had a cartoon in that in 2020 that was to do with the pandemic, which was obviously advancing at that time. She's not afraid to draw body in cartoons. She focuses quite often on sex, and that's what that cartoon did. But like I said, certainly wasn't pornographic, and it was in the context of a completely typical adult humor magazine.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, she's been criminalized for obscenity for that cartoon. Our contention is that that's because of her sex. I don't believe a man submitting the same cartoon would have had to answer to any case at all. I think that because a woman is outspoken, is, let's face it, secularist, is left wing, and this is kind of an unspoken element of it. But again, the fact is that she's Kurdish, who are a persecuted minority in Turkey as well. But first and foremost, a woman. And you can point to multiple cases in Turkey where women from all sorts of different backgrounds, social media influencers, pop stars, poets, authors, you name it, who happen to be female, come in for these kind of accusations. So I would say that those three cases are right now the most pressing because they all entail criminal charges, and the sentences, vary quite a bit, but they all carry, significant prison sentences, if indeed they are found guilty, which in all three cases is highly likely, if not guaranteed, to be honest, because certainly in the case of Iran, and probably in Egypt, I can't imagine the cases not resulting in guilty verdicts. Turkey's slightly different. What you sometimes find in a place like Turkey is the case grinds on indefinitely, which is kind of tactical. It's the point is less about the charges or the sentencing and more about just the process, the grinding process of being in a court case. What's different about Zehra's is because this a panel does a panel that supposedly independently adjudicates on matters of obscenity, and because they have found it obscene, that kind of compels the court to find her guilty. So it would be, it would be extraordinary for them to not find her guilty in those circumstances. Having said that, like I said, there have been delays upon delays upon delays in her sentencing. In fact, the last time there was a court hearing in April, the judge just didn't show up.
Oh,
So it just got kicked in. The can got kicked down the road again. And again, the argument could be made that that's deliberate, that the whole point is just to draw the thing out for as long as they possibly can.
is it sort of a marathon where they're trying to the longer the trial, I guess for all three cases, they basically want to break the cartoonists. Is that basically what
Yeah,
their goal is?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I would argue that. Yes. I mean,
Wow.
Atena has been held before.
Yeah.
Atena was a prisoner for the best part of 2.5 years, all told. I think by the time she was released, um, that didn't break her.
Hmm.
So, from their perspective, perhaps, what do we do next?
Hmm.
Do we jail her for a longer period, or do we engage in this kind of process where there's no certainty of outcome, but there's a constant pressure, a constant
Yeah.
presence
Yeah.
in the life of the cartoonist. Um, and from their point of view, perhaps more effective, because if it never comes to the crunch, if it never comes to the definitive day in court, the handing down of the sentence, the serving of that sentence or fine or whatever it may be, that brings
Yeah.
closure. Whereas endless kind of shuffling of paper and finding excuses to call off court appearances and forestall and delay and say that we're going to go and get somebody else to do a report or what have you,
Hmm.
allows an absence of closure. And the consequence of that then is the cartoonist concerned
Yeah.
can't plan ahead, can't commit. It has an effect on things like relationships. It has an effect on family life. It has an effect on all manner of things.
Yeah.
So, although it seems counterintuitive, an outside observer might say that surely the more effective thing is to stick the person in jail or what have you. Perhaps, but
Okay.
perhaps what's actually more effective is just to constantly threaten them with that prospect
Yeah.
rather than actually having it materialize.
Yeah. I'm curious. These are three high-profile cases, right? It's not just them that are being affected. It's the government making giving a message to other cartoonists. If you do any dissenting cartoons, this is what's going to happen to you. So instead of like some places, they instead of trying to get all cartoonists, maybe they're trying to get one cartoonist and giving them as an example for the other cartoonist. This is what happens to you if you don't, toe the line.
I think whether it's intended or not, it's the inevitable
Result.
consequence. Yeah.
Okay.
I think there are some cases I could mention where you could argue an individual person has been very deliberately targeted.
Okay.
It's about them specifically. There are other cases where you could argue it's less about them personally and more about an example being made. But like I said, in some respects it's a moot point, because whether that's the intention or not, of course,
That's
inevitably it's the consequence. It's definitely the consequence right now in Egypt.
okay.
The cartoonists in Egypt are all um, very palpably affected by what's
Uh,
happened.
okay. 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 Yeah. I'm sorry, but I hope they do. I wish the best for them and stuff. So, okay. I have another question. Around the world, authoritarian governments have been passing anti-terrorist laws and security laws that they use to against their critics. So the Philippines, India, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Nicaragua, and several other places have been using these laws to harass their critics. How have these laws been used against political cartoonists?
I would say frequently and liberally,
Yeah,
unfortunately. Again, it's on its face pretty absurd. There's there's few things you can think of farther away from terrorism
yeah,
than drawing a little cartoon.
yeah,
But nevertheless, that's often what we find being mentioned, or it's at least tangential to the argument that's made by the prosecutors.
yeah.
I mentioned vendettas before. Musa Kart in Turkey, I definitely think was subjected to a vendetta.
Okay.
They tried to criminalize him 3 times. The first 2 times were unsuccessful. They were ultimately successful at the third attempt, and that was only because his choice of travel agent,
Oh,
in their opinion, demonstrated that he was supporting a prescribed terrorist organization.
oh,
The
okay.
contention being that the transaction wasn't actually what it was on its face.
Uh,
He wasn't booking a holiday, he was helping money go
oh,
towards illegal activities.
uh,
Um, so, if not a full blown terrorist, a cartoonist might be accused of supporting terrorism or propagating ideas that are tantamount to terrorism.
okay.
Um, the security laws that have come in Hong Kong um, of late have led to a significant number of cartoonists leaving
Oh,
Hong Kong. Those that remain um, are certainly suffering from a higher degree of accusations of uh, damaging the state. Zunzi, who you'll talk to in your series, Angelo, will expand upon that. You know, that's been his life experience of late.
yeah.
That earned him a Courage Award this year.
Mhm.
We have an alternating arrangement with another organisation, the Freedom Cartoonist Foundation, based in Geneva. So their award this year uh, went to 2 cartoonists. Zunzi was one. In Bangladesh, there's a very liberal, very vague, very wide, very all-encompassing laws concerning digital communications and what does or does not count as misinformation, disinformation, activity that is a threat to security. Another cartoonist, Ahmed Kabir Kishore, fell foul of those laws. Again, another award winner, won our Courage Award in 2020.
Oh,
Um, and so these kind of laws, where what they amount to often is not necessarily an attempt to criminalize terrorists, but to criminalize dissent,
yeah,
to
yeah.
criminalize anybody who is effectively setting themselves up in opposition to the powers that be. And that's challenging for cartoonists because, pretty broadly speaking, we're a disagreeable bunch who want to complain.
Yeah.
It's rare that a cartoonist is, in full voice supporting everything that is going on, espousing the virtues and benefits of the government and the leader of the day and so on and so forth, unless, they're a full-blown propagandist.
Yeah.
So wherever there is a kind of legal provision against that kind of activity and framing it as being actually damaging to security, to the fabric of society, to law and order, to peace, then cartoonists are in the frame, you know,
Yeah.
inevitably. Um, and indeed, quite often they're at the forefront of pushing back against precisely those kind of uh, provisions. One of the best ones I saw was in the Philippines, was the Tumindig campaign that Kevin Eric Raimundo created, the cartoon with the fist,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
fist character. That was a
yeah,
fantastic uh, piece of visual communication,
yeah,
first and foremost, quite apart from anything else. But in terms of what it was actually saying, you know, the context that it was in, and the message that it was putting across,
mhm,
it was tremendous and courageous because, like I said, putting yourself forward like that, spearheading a campaign like that is going to
yeah,
make you a target.
yeah, yeah. Well, the Philippines has that issue with they had an anti-terror law that they're using against there's a thing called red tagging where they accuse anyone who dissents of being a communist insurgent, and that makes anybody who's red tagged very vulnerable to going to jail, being harassed, or even getting killed and stuff. Quite a few red tag people, activists, priests, lawyers, judges, journalists, who've gotten quite a few people who've been red tagged have gotten killed for that and stuff. So that's why I admire the Filipino political cartoonists, because they're criticizing, I guess, both Duterte and Marcos at a time when, during this time of red tagging and extrajudicial killings.
Yeah,
I can criticize Duterte and Marcos, but I'm safe. I'm in the Bay Area
of
and
course.
stuff.
Yeah,
I don't have that issue and stuff, but they're more courageous than I am. I don't know if I was in the same situation, I don't know if I'd have that courage. So I
yeah,
admire their courage and
yeah,
stuff. So yeah. So well, this is a good plug for Filipino political cartoonists. So
absolutely.
yeah. So okay. Let me ask something. The three hot spots in the world that the world is paying attention to right now is in Gaza, the Ukraine, and Sudan. How are the Palestinian, Ukrainian, and Sudanese political cartoonists doing at this time?
Well, to state the obvious, not well. um, you know, again,
Sometimes I ask the obvious.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
Again, I don't mean to be, I don't mean to be glib, but the cartoonists obviously are still, at the end of the day, human beings. They're still
Yeah,
people. They're still citizens of the country in which they live.
yeah,
So when there is a crisis that is universal, then their problems will be identical to and indistinguishable from the problems that all of their fellow countrymen face. So, and that is, obviously the case in Ukraine and so on. Afghanistan,
yeah,
uh, uh, Gaza, it has to be said, right now is the chief disaster, in terms of just across the board failure.
yeah,
We've all failed Gaza terribly, and it's had an effect. It's had an effect on anybody involved in this kind of work, I would say, um, particularly when it's contrasted to the response to Ukraine.
yeah,
Um, I think it's sent a highly regrettable and probably irreversible message
mhm,
to to the Muslim world for sure, perhaps to what we describe as the global South, or even the global majority, more broadly, that
Yeah.
certain lives are held in higher regard, and more values placed upon them than others.
Yeah.
So for our group, our group specifically, like I said at the top, for us, cases are about where people are targeted because of something that they've drawn.
Yeah.
And to be honest, that isn't the case in Gaza right now. People in Gaza are being targeted because they're in Gaza, not because of anything that they've done.
Yeah.
It's whatever they may or may not have done is completely immaterial. They're in they're in danger because of specifically where they live, and their background. So all of the cartoonists are in the same boat. The
So it's
name I
not
would make,
it's not specifically in your purview, I guess, but it's just something that concerns you because they're cartoonists.
yeah, but not yet, of course, not yet.
Oh,
At
okay.
any moment that could change. At any
Okay.
moment that could change. But as I sit here right now, I can't in all honesty say that I'm aware of a Gazan cartoonist who is being targeted because of something that they've drawn in a way
Oh,
that is in a way that outstrips what's happening to them because of what has ensued in the past year.
yeah.
Um, One name that I would mention is Safa Oda, a cartoonist who still posts to Facebook, and her family are homeless. Her home was destroyed by an Israeli bomb.
Yeah.
She's been in a refugee camp ever since, and has now resorted to drawing on the plastic sheeting inside the
Wow.
tent,
Yeah.
because there's no paper.
Yeah.
And she'll take a photograph of the cartoon, post it to Facebook, erase it, and then draw something else. As long as her pens last, there'll come a day where her pens are gone, and then that'll be that.
Yeah.
One organization I would want to mention in this context is in the United States, the Cartoonist Cooperative,
Oh,
and
okay.
they've done really good work with eSIMs, helping people inside Gaza stay in touch with the outside world.
Okay.
So if people visit their website, cartoonist.coop, COOP, cartoonist.coop, there's information about how to support that campaign, and help people stay in touch, because right now, as long as this thing lasts, um,
Okay.
any
So
notion any notion of assistance is kind of moot if we can't maintain communication with
okay.
people. So it's for all sorts of reasons. It's vital to try and keep the lines of communication open.
Okay. So I'm curious. You're not able to communicate with the cartoonists in Gaza, except for that one female cartoonist and stuff. Would your focus then be more on West Bank cartoonists, where there's more clearer communication? I'm sure that because of the settler impunity and stuff, that
Yeah,
there must
yeah,
be some issues going on with Palestinian cartoonists in the West Bank and stuff. But
yeah.
since the focus is in Gaza, we're probably not
Indeed,
hearing
so yeah,
the problems.
yeah,
Are they going
yeah.
through censorship too, or?
I would say that they are, but again, at this stage, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the censorship of cartoonists has spiked in the same way
Oh,
that actual physical violence against any and all people in the West Bank has. So, but again, with the perennial caveat, that's as you and I are speaking. Tomorrow, I
oh,
I could get an email saying such and such a cartoonist definitely has suffered because of a cartoon that was published or what have you.
Mhm.
And you know, again, in terms of the other places that you mentioned, same with Ukraine. You know, there aren't really any Ukrainian cartoonists who are suffering specifically because of something that they've drawn.
Yeah.
They're suffering because, again, they've either had to leave their home or because they've, you know, otherwise been displaced or they've lost family members or what have you, all because of the fact that they happen to be in Ukraine. We did fairly early on in that in the war hear from a group inside Ukraine who were creating comics, and you know, to be honest, hadn't set out to do a war journalism project. Obviously, it was a completely different project when they started working together
Yeah.
a couple of years ago. But they kind of on the hoof changed what they were doing and started doing comics about the conflict. So they're called Inker, Inker, Inker. Their website
Oh,
is inker.world. As I
uh-huh.
say, that's an initiative we've supported. And similarly, in terms of Sudan, I would mention a project by my friend Khalid Al-Bai, probably the best known Sudanese cartoonist in the world. He is now working with um, a number of displaced Sudanese cartoonists, and indeed some that have actually left Sudan. Cartoon Mag, KHARTOON, cartoonmag.com.
Oh, okay.
And that's showcasing the work of, as I say, displaced Sudanese cartoonists and reflecting upon what's happened there in recent years.
Yeah.
So, you know, we talk about cartoonists all the time. Cartoonists are my clients, my friends, my day to day. But it's really important to say that they don't suffer uniquely.
Okay.
Cartoonists are not the most put upon people in the world
Yeah.
as a group. You know,
Yeah.
they are not the be all and end all in terms of human suffering. Um, they are of interest, like I said before, because they are such a useful barometer. If you live in a, you know, it's not a surprise to hear that
Yeah.
cartoonists somewhere like Afghanistan, and particularly obviously since the return of the Taliban, are unable to express themselves because nobody
Yeah.
can express themselves freely in Afghanistan. So it's not a surprise to
Yeah.
hear that. It's not a surprise to hear about some of these other places. But if you live in a part of the world that has hitherto enjoyed a degree of freedom of expression, democratic rights, and so on and so forth, and then all of a sudden there's a case where a cartoonist is being criminalized or silenced or, you know, in some other way suffering. That's an indication of something going. I would suggest it's an indication of something going wrong at a deeper
Yeah.
level.
It's a symptom to a wider threat,
Yeah.
a wider threat to democracy. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm curious. You know, when we think of political cartooning, we usually think satire, political satire. But are you finding that as cartoonists in war-torn countries, it switches from satire to war reportage, like you were mentioning about Ukraine and stuff? Is that a universal thing where or their goal stops being satirizing and it becomes more these people are suffering because of this, and they want to report on the am I right or am I wrong?
I would say that's fair. I think that you know the cartoons that are still being produced either by, you know, like I said, either by the very few people remaining in Gaza that are in a position to draw any cartoons, or their compatriots in the West Bank, or cartoonists across the Arab world, you know, in the past year have really wanted to communicate first and foremost, their objection to to the horror. They are disgust at the perceived double standard,
Yeah, yeah,
and their frustration at the inaction from so many quarters, and so consequently, they are not cartoons that are necessarily satirical so
mhm,
much as they are just flatly statements of protest.
yeah,
And so, yes, I would say that likewise in Ukraine, what you can discern again is cartoonists that remain there, or cartoonists that have left, those that were able to leave Ukraine early on in the conflict,
yeah,
reflecting back, are often talking about the international response or lack thereof, if that's their point of view, and the way that the 2 years down the line,
mhm,
which we are, I was just double checking my own timeline there, 2 years
yeah,
into the conflict, the extent to which it's become background noise in a lot of
yeah,
ways, that we're now inured to it, and how long that will last, how long will the European Union, certainly, but all the stakeholders in Europe, never mind NATO, how long will they kind of accept the idea that a war like this can go on? So
yeah,
um, I think it's a mistake often to assume that cartoonists are in the business of humor
yeah,
necessarily. I think
yeah,
I think humor is obviously an enormous factor, uh, but some of the most pointed and effective editorial political cartoons aren't really humorous.
yeah,
They
yeah,
are they're expressions of something less ironic. They're more
yeah,
kind of sincere expressions of disgust or despair or anger about a
yeah.
particular issue.
Yeah, I've been doing cartoons on the extrajudicial killings, and none of those cartoons are funny and stuff
Mm.
because I just don't think you can see anything humorous in extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. But I'm wondering, I think part of what you're saying, I always get the feeling that in those situations, cartoonists are just arguing that the people who are getting killed are human. They're not just numbers and stuff. And it's I think it's a fight against the dehumanization of Palestinians, Ukrainians, Sudanese and stuff, because I mean, um, they're not just collaterals of war. These are human beings who are getting killed,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
vast numbers and stuff. And I always think that at least the best cartoonists, they argue for the humanity of the people who are getting killed, I guess.
yeah. I would agree with that, and because it's a human instinct,
Yeah.
every human being, this is my pet theory anyway, but every human being, at least in their early childhood, is a mark maker.
Yeah.
You put a child of 5 or 6 in front of a pile of paper and some crayons. They don't ask permission or figure out what the brief is, or think about what the outcome might be before they just start drawing. They just start. The
Mhm.
drawings just happen.
Yeah.
And it's the lucky few of us who still have our drawings on the family refrigerator past the age of 6 or 7. You
I'm
know,
sure my wife has
most,
some
yeah,
cartoons pinned
yeah,
up in my
yeah, yeah.
refrigerator.
Most parents, when their kid gets to 6 or 7, start to just take the drawings and just,
Yeah.
discreetly dispose of them. But there's a few of us who still have those drawings on the refrigerator past that point, and we're the ones that keep continue.
Yeah.
But we're only continuing with something that's, in my opinion, pretty kind of hardwired in. It's kind of fundamental part of the human condition. So when you are affected by a drawing, when a drawing communicates meaning to you, it's powerful.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is why, in my opinion, it's why any of these cartoonists are in trouble in the first place. Self-evidently, if the cartoons were crap that didn't actually connect with anyone, then why on earth would anybody ever
Why
be
would any
upset or
government waste their
troubled, or
time?
any government want to waste their, as you say, waste their time in
Yeah.
going after such a person? It's not about the impudence of the cartoonists themselves. It's about what that cartoonist's impudence sparks in everybody else.
Yeah.
If that even in some small part contributes towards a movement, a weight of public opinion,
Yeah.
encourages someone to speak up, to protest, to contribute in some way to something, if not full-blown revolutionary, then at least reformist, or in any way counter to the interests of power, then
Yeah.
inevitably an authoritarian is going to be troubled by that and try and suppress it at the outset.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. A few cartoonists mentioned to me that they worry about their cartoons preaching to the choir and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember I mentioned this to a poet, and the poet said that, sometimes the choir needs to be preached. So, like, if your cartoons are not going to appeal to the 80% of the people who support an authoritarian government,
Yeah.
the cartoon may be for the 20% of the people to let them know they're not alone and that they can dissent and stuff. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
ever
I
since the
think
point.
I think that's ultimately what I think that's what I would want. I think that's my uh, what would gratify me, I suppose, most would not necessarily be the idea that somebody saw something and laughed, but the idea that somebody saw something and it corresponded with what they were feeling, and they realize, yeah, I'm not the only person that thinks that way.
Yeah, yeah,
That's the
yeah.
point.
Yeah, that's not my original idea. I got that idea from a poet, so I don't want to claim I don't want to claim any great insight on that. But okay, so let me ask another question and stuff. This one has to do with online cartoonists as opposed to newspaper cartoonists. In the United States, and I think around the world, newspapers are on the decline, and more political cartoonists are posting their work on Instagram, Facebook, and other social media. What are the special threats that an online political cartoonist face as opposed to a political cartoonist who works in a newspaper?
Your observation's quite correct. I would suggest that um, it's an undisputed fact that news platforms are in decline,
Mhm.
um, and even the ones that remain uh, command dwindling audiences, and with that dwindling revenues. Never mind, as you mentioned, the kind of polarization and kind of silo effect, depending
Yeah,
upon the politics of the outlet and everything else. And on the other side of that same coin, the extent to which everybody online is their own content creator and is at liberty to broadcast, to write, to create, to put out their own take continuously. And so there's no question that in terms of what we talked about right at the start, the idea of a staff position, full-time cartoonist is all but gone.
Yeah.
It's all but gone. And those that remain, who are still appearing, their work is still appearing wherever news is consumed, are not on staff. They are a contributor of some description. They're off-site. They're probably freelance. They're probably either self-syndicating, or they are, distributing their works through some other kind of third party. And if that isn't happening, then they are simply in essence an entirely self-employed a freelancer who just puts the work out there on a speculative basis, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what that means is, when things go wrong, when somebody is threatened, for the most part, these people don't have the backup that would come with an employer,
Yeah.
or at the very least, a news organization who would, in some respects, share in the responsibility of the publication or dissemination of that cartoon.
Yeah.
So the kind of headline, if you like, in this part of the conversation is, frankly, loneliness, isolation.
Yeah.
Even before the pandemic, but certainly since,
Yeah.
cartoonists are working alone.
Yeah.
And so it makes the existence of my organization and all of our other colleagues and partners and counterparts in different parts of the world even more important
Yeah.
than they were before, because we're the only thing that exists then to kind of countermand that sense of vulnerability that comes with being completely devoid of the support that comes from colleagues, peers, never
Yeah.
mind, as I say, editors, managers, publishers, people that maybe in the past traditionally would have gone to bat for you if you
Yeah.
had got into trouble. In
Yeah.
terms of what cartoonists are exposed to online, as we talked about earlier, anywhere where there are laws that can subject digital communications to a very low threshold in terms of what constitutes criminality.
Yeah.
When it comes to dissent, what they would categorize as misinformation or disinformation, your entire digital footprint then becomes a potential well from which something incriminating can be drawn. There's no doubt in my mind that obviously a huge amount of traffic online is no longer human.
Oh, yeah.
We know that governments use bots. We know that governments use automation. We know that a lot of that is state sponsored.
Yeah.
So if a given government wants to suppress a particular cartoonist, in the days of in the pre-social media days, where everybody was concerned perhaps first and foremost with their own website, you would see things like DDoS attacks and other ways of knocking the site offline. now in a world where social media is the main driver, then you would be talking about instances where the account is either flagged as being in violation of the terms of service or the community guidelines for a particular platform. And because those decisions are so often themselves automated, because it's not a human being coming to the determination about whether or not a cartoon is or is not acceptable, generally speaking, you can kind of be assured that the cartoon is going to be removed from the platform if indeed the cartoonist themselves isn't either suspended or banned or what have you. And in terms of the cartoonists themselves, of course, the last thing that they might, unfortunately, it's the truth that many of them now not only have to deal with it, but expect it, have come to in a strange way have come to kind of regard it as just part of what it is to be a cartoonist. Is the comments and the trolling and the threats and the toxicity that ensues in the comments and the messages that are sent to the cartoonist. And again, it has to be said, this is not unique, of course, for cartoonists by any stretch of the imagination, but as with everyone else on the internet, it's the women who receive the worst of that kind of attack, as opposed to men. You're going to be talking to Rachita Taneja from India, who draws the sanitary panels cartoon strips. Again, I won't steal her thunder, but she will, I'm sure, expand upon that upon that point. Another case I would mention, another one of our award winners, Courage Award winners, is the Chinese cartoonist Badi Tiao, who now lives in Australia. Search for his name on Twitter, X, and prepare to be astounded by the sheer number of impersonators, the sheer number of accounts that are claiming to be him, on a scale that can only be industrial, on a scale that can only be state sanctioned. It's not just one or two people bored and for the sake of something to do pretending to be him. It's an organized, constant project designed simply to disrupt, to confuse, to discredit. And so all of those things are perennial problems, I would say, that are hard to counter. Where we can, we've at times intervened on behalf of cartoonists with companies like Meta if a particular cartoonist has found that their account has been suspended or they don't have access to their to their feeds anymore or what have you. But it's hard, obviously, from from the point of view of countering all these automated decisions that I'm talking about. Their argument will be the sheer numbers are such that we can't possibly employ people to manage everything. The human content moderators that do exist are at the really sharp end. They are looking at the absolute worst stuff that gets put online, and identifying, the child abusers and the human traffickers, and all the stuff that requires that level of scrupulous investigation and attention. And so their argument will be, we can't possibly actually have people just looking at every single shitty comment that gets posted underneath somebody's cartoon. Which again, I don't know how you argue the counterpoint. It's just they're not wrong. It's just there's just so much of it all the time, constantly, that you're never gonna be able to stop it from happening. So all that we can do, I would say, are probably a couple of things. One is, like I mentioned before, is to be there for people when they do find themselves at the center of one of these big controversies that happen every so often. I'm not talking about someone who's getting 2 or 3 nasty comments every so often, but somebody who suddenly finds themselves, because of something they've drawn, getting thousands of comments and becoming the topic of conversation in a 24 or 48-hour period online. In situations like that, I think it's important to if possible, to reach out to the cartoonists, to communicate them, to make sure that they're okay, to make sure that they don't do anything rash, to make sure that they understand that.
So you're checking on their mental health too.
Yeah. To make sure that they understand that the nature of these things is that, for the most part, they are fleeting, they are temporary, they are very quickly forgotten. Somebody else comes along and says something controversial the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and before you know it, you're several dozen places down the order of controversies of the day. But equally, like I said, it is bullying, and that is unacceptable. And I certainly don't think that I don't think it's fair or reasonable that so many cartoonists have come to the conclusion that they just have to accept that this is part of the job, or part of the or a necessary and unavoidable consequence of what they're doing. So I'm not ready to talk about it just yet, but there is I do want to let people, who are listening to this, know that we do want to get more information from people about this. We want to talk and gather some data about this particular phenomenon.
Like a poll or survey?
Like a survey or a poll, and get a better sense of. I mean, a good scientist will say, don't prejudge before you go in and gather the data. but I'm pretty convinced that that everyone has encountered this to some degree. The question is just magnitude. But I think everyone has had a problem with this sooner or later. And so I want to, on the one hand, I want to confirm that is the case. I want to demonstrate that it's touched everybody, and then quantify it a little bit more, get into the some of the specifics. What are we talking about? Just people are entitled to tell you they don't like their cartoon, obviously. So we're not talking about somebody writing.
Are you talking about like threats?
We're talking about threats. We're talking about any mention or invocation or allusion to violence.
Okay.
We're talking about anybody making comments that are gendered.
Yeah.
We're talking about anybody making comments that are pertaining to race or to sexuality or to any other kind of protected characteristic. And then, with that in hand, perhaps we would be able to make a more substantive case to some of these to some of these platforms in terms of how content is moderated and how decisions are made. So yeah, again, depending on when you're listening to this conversation, maybe come and check in on our website and see what stage that project is at.
Well, thank you for doing that. I know the Philippines, the Nobel Prize winner, Maria Ressa, she's doing a similar project and trying to show data information to force, especially Meta, to change some of their policies and stuff. So
I've had the pleasure of hearing her speak a couple of times on that topic, and she's absolutely the gold standard, I would suggest, in terms of through her own lived experience, of course, but also in terms of what she would suggest. The damage that's been done by the culture that's prevailed on social media, and perhaps what we can do to start fixing that.
Yeah, well, good luck on that and stuff. Send me the survey and stuff. I'll try to.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have two more questions to ask. The first one, I think you've already mentioned several cases of how Cartoonists Rights Network can help cartoonists, but could you just give me a general overview of how Cartoonists Rights Network International can help political cartoonists who's in jail or under threat? What do they do?
So, it's important again to emphasize the fact that we're a small organization. So there is a limit to what we can accomplish, and the good news stories, of which there are several. I know this has been a pretty heavy conversation, but there are good stories as well. There are stories of cartoonists rescued. There are stories of cartoonists who found safety and sanctuary, who are able to start again or to resume their careers and continue to produce work to this day. And when that happens, in my opinion, it generally happens because of a chain. It's never just one organization or one individual that's made the change. It's always a coalition, a chain, people contributing what they can, their expertise, depending on their location, to render the desirable result. But I would say that firstly, in a strange way, this is part of the job. Just raising awareness and being an advocate for cartoonists is a big part of the job, because, as I said before, particularly now when we are in a situation where so many of them do not and will not, going forward, have a media partner, a newspaper, a TV station, a news provider of any description, backing them up, then it's more important that there is a cartoonist specific organization or organizations to speak on their behalf, speak up for them, advocate for what they do, explain the value of it, explain why as we discussed, it can be such a significant indicator of wider problems in a given place. So, in having said that, let's say a specific cartoonist is in trouble, then I would encourage them to make contact with us. And what, perhaps even more importantly, the cartoonist should make sure that their next of kin knows what to do, knows who to make contact with, because
I didn't think of that. Yeah.
If the worst happens, they're not in a position to make a phone call, send an email, let people know what's happened. So it's just as important that a wife, husband, partner, sibling, best friend, whoever it may be, knows that if things go south, please let this organization know what's happened to me. We have a a number of lawyers on our panel who can provide initial guidance in the event that somebody has been arrested or received notice of criminal charges or something like that.
Yeah.
Again, I want to be clear, we're not going to help you with your divorce. We're not going to help you with if you're buying a home or if you have you want to sue someone for copyright. That's not us. This is again very much in the realm of human rights violations. So if it's any of the kind of criminal charges along the lines that we've talked about earlier on, then let us know about that. Go to cartoonistrights.org/legal and let us know about any case of that nature. If it's not legal, if it's not a criminal case, but it's the kind of stuff that we were talking about just a few minutes ago, where somebody's just having a really hard time because of trolls and backlash and bad publicity, and people are just being incredibly unpleasant to them, then again, it's about moral support, as opposed to necessarily saying that they're going to be seeing anybody in court or anything like that. And again, in the very worst case scenarios, in those times where we are talking about real, danger to life and limb, we will, when we can, talk about actual material support for people that need to move. They need to get out of the situation wherever they are. So there's multiple strands to it, and it's all dependent upon, of course, the severity of the case, and indeed sometimes the nature of the people that are making the threats. There's multiple cases where we have helped, but you'll never hear me talk about it because either the person has specifically said, don't talk about me.
Yeah.
Or the family of that person has said, don't talk about them. Or by other ways or means, it's just common sense, because to talk about the person will make them a target again. So it's a fine balancing act always, with a lot of these cases where, again, an outside observer, I think, could very easily get the impression that it's always a case of make a big noise, start a campaign, get all the cartoonists to draw cartoons about this person, etc., etc., etc. Occasionally, sometimes, that is absolutely the tactic. A lot of the time, it's not.
Okay.
So it's all dependent upon the specifics.
Okay. Well, thank you for doing that and stuff. So, okay. I guess the last question I can ask you is, okay, for a political cartoonist is under a threat, what should they do?
First and foremost, understand that you're not alone.
Okay.
We talked about what you can do in terms of, contacting us directly. And we'll make sure that, the relevant information is underneath this video, for anybody that wants to do that. I'll list probably some other alternatives. We're certainly not the only game in town. There are other organisations as well that have done great work in terms of support for cartoons. So we'll list some of those too, underneath this video. Take the steps that I mentioned earlier, in terms of making sure there's at least one other person that knows about all these other resources and organizations as well. Don't take it necessarily entirely upon your own shoulders, because that's just being smart. That's just being wise. It's the same as having a fire drill. You know, it's just a sensible precaution to take. I would say that for those who are fortunate to not have had any trouble in their careers, don't take too much for granted. Especially not these days. We look around the map, there's few places in the world where authoritarianism isn't on the rise, even if it's a government that isn't a full-blown dictatorship. There are very few democratically elected governments that haven't at least contemplated specific measures that are pretty draconian when it comes to dissent, as we talked about before. So the cartoonists everywhere need to be conscious of that, aware of that, on their toes, understand that things can change quite rapidly, and but as I say, at the same time, not to give in to complete existential fear. I think that we all, precisely because, as I mentioned earlier, precisely because there aren't that many of us in the world. The advantage of that is that I think we are a pretty together group. Again, talking about the connections in France and everything else, I think we are all, one at a push, two friends away from each other. Everybody knows at least a friend of everybody else. And so I've, I think I've been quite lucky. I think in terms of being able to do this work, the primary appeal of it to me has been the people. It's been the people that I've met as a consequence of doing this. And what that has taught me is that I think we can be relied upon to pull together and express solidarity and protect the freedom of expression that we all value so much and depend upon.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. So, and I don't know, do you have anything else to add to that, or I can say goodbye and stuff. Thank you for
the last word, as always, is we are, like I said, we are a non-profit. We don't get to do what we do without donations. So if anyone who's listened to this is moved to support us, then go to cartoonistrights.org/donate, and you'll find the mechanism there by which you can make a donation to support what we're doing. Our annual pledge drive every year always begins on Giving Tuesday, the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And this year that's Tuesday the 3rd of December. So if you visit us then, or in the days after that into the holidays, you'll find some incentives, some rewards for those that do support us then. Hopefully we will be able to give you some cartoons, some cartoon artwork that would be a nice thank you for those that support us at that time.
That's so cool. Well, thank you for your hard work and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. What I can also do is I'll put all of those links in the description below,
Mhm.
and also at the end of the video, I can also add something too. So
Sure.
thank you very much.